Zoom recording. There we go. All right, so you can see the growing young screen. No Slido this morning, so we're not going to worry about that. Just to let you know. Today we're going to talk about the last two of the commitments, the core commitments. The one that I'm going to take this morning is prioritize young people and families everywhere. And I'd like to ask your indulgence this morning because I'm going to just bring out a little bit in one of the things that we did at GCA Church. So if it sounds like bragging, it is. Let's just go with it.
Yeah, go All for
it. Here's what we typically find. Older people usually lead churches and they naturally prioritize themselves. And so what happens is as we look at church priorities, how we spend the budget, where we do things, because it's typically the older adults that are represented, theirs are the only needs that really get addressed, except for when you have an adult that comes in and says, we need something for the children's department, we need this or that. And they will say, oh, well, okay, we'll give you $100 or we'll give you $500 or whatever. And so typically what happens is our youth, young adults, young families are typically underserved when it comes to how much of the budget, different things that we do that prioritize. If you want to grow young, then we have to prioritize young people everywhere. Now, does this mean that we do that in exclusion to everybody else? No. No, as a matter of fact, we have to do that as we take in the needs of everybody else, but we need to understand that unless you do this, you will actually depart from this wheel. Remember, we have this wheel here that we've looked at. And it's possible that you can be the best neighbors, you can have keychain leadership, you can have empathy, Jesus message, warm relationships, and then you see that little dotted line that jumps off of there. It's possible you can do 5 out of the 6 things, but if you don't complete the circle and continue to complete the circle on a yearly basis, what happens is you can jump off the wheel here. And this is the linchpin, I think, of the whole thing. Because when we began to look at the GCA Church, this was probably the biggest, if you want to put it, fight that we had. Because people don't want to be deprioritized. And so as we began talking about elevating the needs of the young people, prioritizing them and focusing on their needs and helping them, I began to hear a lot of things like, well, what about us? Well, what about us? And I kept hearing, what about us? What about us? So long, that it sounded like a broken record. And that was the standard comeback to anytime we tried to advance something there. Now, when I got to GCA in 1999, there were some interesting things going on at the church there. I was the 5th pastor in 6 years. GCA had a tumultuous history. They had a long line of people that had rotated through the doors, but it wasn't just the pastorate, it was also the principal. Before Fortis Kink, who is the one just before Gerard, they had gone through 6 principals in about 6 or 7 years. And so it was a rough landscape out there, and GCA was having a hard time. As we began to put this package together, we did not have a big building, we did not have a big budget, we did not have anything. What we had was a group of people that wanted to serve kids but weren't sure how. And so when I got to this prioritize young people, they kept saying, well, what about us? What about us? We don't want to be left behind. And this is the biggest fear that adults have. And I just said, okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Now, in the physical world, if a child is not feeding themselves by age 5, we would call that developmentally delayed. Back in my day, growing up, the word we used, which has now become a bad term, but we always used it, was retarded. Your growth was retarded. And so I said, if you were a child of 5 years of age and you're not feeding yourself, then there was a problem. And you keep saying, what about us? Who's going to feed us? And I said, as a pastor, let me ask you a question. Who feeds me? And they went, well, you're the pastor. I think you should feed yourself. And I said, exactly. And if you're 5 years of age or more in the Christian church, you should be feeding yourself, or we would call you spiritually developmentally delayed. So the issue is not so much prioritizing to the exclusion of everybody else, but prioritizing so that everybody else can actually come along and grow young, so that this church can actually have the best chance. Now, let's go on with this. We talk about rhetoric versus reality. Now, we often hear statements like, children are the church of tomorrow. That's rhetoric. What it really means, the dark side of that is, they're not really important today. We can't really get to their needs today. They're the church of tomorrow. Let them figure it out when they get here. Reality would say that oftentimes, because in boards we vote what we are concerned about, most of the time we aren't really concerned about our kids until they start leaving. And by then, oftentimes, it's pretty hard to reverse the trend. Now, when we look at this particular commitment, here's two myths that Fuller found not to be true. The big modern church building or the big budget, that you have to have those. We started at GCA in 1999 with 32 giving units to support 250 young people. We were in the chapel, and we were crammed in the chapel. My office was a white construction trailer. I jokingly told people I was white trailer park trash. The thing was, they agreed, but that was another story.
Stop it.
So when you look at this whole thing, though, we begin to look at the pie, and the typical fear by most adults, and what we found at GCA was this: if we divide, and let's say that this represents all, this big section represents all the rest of the church, and the small section represents the youth. What we found was everybody was afraid that, well, if I give away my piece of the pie, if we give away a bigger piece of the pie to the kids, that leaves less for everybody else. Now, if you look at this inner circle, that would be the pie we started with. In actuality, what we found was when we gave a bigger piece of the pie to the young people, there ended up being a whole lot more pie. So we didn't really lose out on any pie. We just had more because the young people actually took that, and as they began to work through this whole deal, and they began to help us lift the church, it began to attract new people. We had 65 members at that time. At this time, the church has about 191. It attracted new families that said, hey, we want to be on board with that. We want that for our kids. And so rather than it diminishing and taking away from the pie at large, it actually enhanced the pie. It actually added to the pie. So when we talk about, giving them a bigger piece of the pie, the fears aren't really, I don't think, grounded that you'll end up losing pie. You end up gaining a whole lot more, and that second circle outside would represent that. One person put it, everyone rises when we focus on young people. So everyone rises, not just the small things. So the fear of, well, if we give them a piece of the pie that's less for the rest of us is not really true. It's not really accurate. It actually enlarges the pie. And so if we're going to give them a bigger piece of the pie, what does it mean? First of all, it means intentionally paying attention. Intentionally paying attention. Focusing there. How does that happen? Well, it's always been said that your day timer and your checkbook will tell of your priorities. I think the same thing is true when we look at prioritizing young people. Your budget is a manifesto of your priorities. When you look at your church budget and you see that you've got hardly anything going towards young people, it would tell you you're not prioritizing them. You might be doing all those other things well, but if you miss that one prioritizing, you go off the chart and you begin to grow old. And so you can come around that circle, but if you don't complete the circle, then what happens is you begin to grow old while you think you're growing young. Why does that happen? Well, because we lock in on generations. This is why I tell churches they need to start a new youth ministry or a new, at least collegiate ministry every 3 to 4 years. The reason why you do that is because we lock in on our generation. We lock in on the people that we're with. So when I was at Battleground, in Meadowglade Church in Battleground, as youth young adult pastor, we began a new collegiate and post-collegiate group every 3 to 4 years, because as they would form a cohesive bond, they would move through life together. And so every 3 years, we didn't call it the Collegiate Sabbath School. We had them name themselves. So they had, Acceptance Sabbath School. They had Awareness Sabbath School. They had the Bereans. They named themselves because as they went through life, you didn't still have the Collegiate Sabbath School members being 40 years old, or the post-collegiates. And I tell churches, don't name it post-collegiates. Name it something else. And then as that begins to, they begin to grow older, you can move them out of the way and put another Sabbath school there to take care of those post-collegiates. And so as you look at this thing and they do life together, you're going to constantly be recreating things. So your budget needs to reflect how you support those kids. It's not about spoiling young people. It's about giving them scaffolding. And what we often don't do is we don't give them the scaffolding they need to actually be able to climb up on it. So giving young people then a piece of the pie means to be intentional about looking at them. A second thing, giving young people a bigger slice of the pie means to prioritize families. Now, when I became a youth pastor, I was at Madison Campus Church, I was at Medical Church, both of those over 1,000 members. And the model that we used at that time was, and some churches, they still use this model, was that you focus only on the youth. And what happens is that parents often become kind of almost the enemy, so to speak. You're thinking, man, I could do wonderful things. And when I was much younger, I had this opinion of myself that I was God's gift to the church, and I knew it. And I was here to set things straight. I was here to show people how it's supposed to be done. And if they could only get on board with what I was doing, then we would be in heaven by now, But the rest of those ding dongs couldn't get this thing because they kept fighting me about youth ministry. And so we focused on youth, and we kind of almost pushed the parents out. But in actuality, what's happened is we, in so doing, we actually created what I call a dry cleaning ministry. It's like people would bring their kids to us, drop them off like they would their clothes at the dry cleaners. And we would do a 75-minute spiritual wash and dry. And then we'd hand them back to the parents after Sabbath school, and it was their problem. As if we could make a huge difference in that 75 minutes. And so we've taken youth ministry and we've almost made it a dry cleaning ministry. You drop them off, you stay out of our way, we'll clean them for you, and then we'll give them back. The problem with that is parents are still the #1 influencer in a child's life. Right. And if we don't partner with parents, then we lose a huge component. And so what we've got to do, I think, is begin to elevate parents into volunteer staff and even paid staff if you have that kind of budget with a larger church. But, you know, in some of our small churches, obviously that's not an issue because we have no youth pastor and the parents are the ones carrying the load anyway. But in actuality, we need an intergenerational, multi-generational approach to helping kids. And so what we've got to do is begin to incorporate the parents, begin to include them in how we plan and what we do. And yeah, it's going to be messy and it's going to take some more time, especially when you get those troublesome parents that, you know, some of them still want to have the dry cleaner thing. They want you to fix their kid. They'll drop them off and say, please fix them. Those are the same ones. Many times they'll drop them off at the academy saying, fix them in 4 years, I'll pick them up, hoping they're all good. But we've got to create training for parents and develop communication rhythms with parents. Now, there was one church that I heard of that they actually took the idea that parents are already familiar with, that is parent-teacher conferences, and it was a large church, and so they began having pastor-parent conferences to say, you know, this is what I see you could do with your child. These are some areas that I think you could develop that spiritual awareness within that child. Here's some things that you could do, I think. And so they began a parent newsletter. They began developing parenting ideas. At the Meadow Glade Church, we started this whole idea with, we had too many parents in our cradle roll department. We found that oftentimes the parents would leave the church, or the young people would leave the church, wouldn't come back until they had their first kid. And when they came back, they wouldn't go to church, they'd only go to Sabbath school. So they were all wanting to sit down and cradle roll and just be with their kid. And the problem was it was overcrowding our cradle roll room, and you don't need both parents to watch one child in there. And so what we developed was a creative parenting ministry that we ran 2 weeks in a row. We'd run the same lesson 2 weeks in a row, and 1 week the mom would be in there, the next week the dad would be in there, and we would switch them out. And we'd go through parenting ideas and different stages of things that you can look for with your child, how to develop them, how to raise them in the fear and the admonition of the Lord, different things to be aware of, their spiritual development, all those kind of things. And we began finding a huge field of work to do there. And that began to go through the kindergartners and the primary, the juniors, and they were saying, parents were saying, can you give us parenting seminars on what we should be watching for? And so we began developing that. And as we did, those young families began to just swell the ranks of the church. And we went from 900 members to over 1,200 members in a period of 4 to 5 years as we focused on developing parents. And so this is one of the ideas that we've got to do as far as prioritizing young people. It's also prioritizing those families along with them. And as you prioritize the families, you begin to develop an entire infrastructure, a whole building of people that can actually come in then and help lift the rest of the church. Thirdly, giving young people a bigger slice means, and if you watch HGTV, I don't know if you guys are HGTV people or not. I'm hardcore HGTV. I love it. But it means young people must play a load-bearing role. Now, in construction, a load-bearing wall, those of you guys who have done any kind of remodeling know, the load-bearing wall is what holds up the structure. Oftentimes, we give kids non-load-bearing responsibilities. Just in case they mess up, it's not going to hurt anything, you know. And while that may be a good on-ramp to get them into that, what happens is they begin to realize right away, this isn't that important. If I don't do this, nobody cares. But if they have a load-bearing role, you know, you're on for the PA booth this week. And if you don't show up, nobody's doing it. We're stuck without you. We got to have you. And if you can't be there, you need to find a replacement because we've got to have somebody in that capacity. It's a load-bearing role. And if we can put young people in load-bearing roles, what happens is we find time after time, they will rise to that. As a matter of fact, we'd say higher requirement equals a higher reward. Yes, it's a higher risk, overall, but the rewards that come from it are huge. I can give you a list of people right now in our conference that this particular thing worked on when they were in academy. First one I would point to is Josh Woods, who's now chaplain at the academy. I could point to Matt Smith, who's at Marietta. I could point to Nate Dubbs, who's at Collegedale Community. I could point to all kind of people within this conference that came through the GCA church, and with the higher requirements came higher rewards. Keith Bowman's another one who just became associate at Hamilton Community. As you look at these guys, these are people who went through this type of training when they were in high school. And as they had more responsibilities, we transferred more and more stuff to them. They began to rise to the challenge and now have become some of our best pastors in the field. We also have teachers in the field the same way. Courtney Day, well, now Courtney Stevens, great teacher. There's a lot of different teachers within our conference that came through GCA during this time that as we transferred those load-bearing roles to them, they took that, they rose to the occasion, and it has actually worked out well. We've had a lot more in our workforce, in the Adventist workforce, in the pastoral field, because of the way we've treated young people there. So young people must play a load-bearing role. And here's the caveat: don't just use them as cheap labor. You know, when I was growing up, well, even now, young people end up having to do what nobody else in the church wants to do. When I was growing up, some of the toughest in-gathering, you guys remember in-gathering? Have mercy. I'm so glad that's not, I shouldn't say that out loud, should I? But I remember the worst territory was always given to the young people because nobody wanted to go there. The long days were given to the young people. Nobody wanted to do it. If it was a evangelistic series coming up, well, let's send the young people out to pass out flyers because the old people didn't want to do it. And it doesn't take young people very long to realize you're just using us for cheap labor. This is not load bearing. This is simply something that you don't want to do. And why should we want to do it if you don't want to do it? And so we need to understand that we've got to take a look at how we do this and what we're doing so that we're allowing young people to take load-bearing roles. Now, how do we do this? Well, Andy Stanley, you guys maybe have heard of him. He made a statement that I had to sit and ponder for a while. He said, time in erodes awareness of. Now, I had to ponder that for a while because it kind of twisted my mind a little bit. Time in erodes awareness of. The longer you have been on the board, for example, the more it erodes your awareness of what everybody else is doing. The time in your church begins to erode what you actually see. When I was coaching the Waycross Church, the first time I drove up to it, I saw all kind of horrible things. I mean, it was, there were weeds growing through the cracks. As I walked up to the front door, the doors were dirty and stained. There were 2 concrete planters on either side of the door that had 3 dead bushes each in them. I mean, every one of the things were dead. And the bench that was sitting outside was cracked and worn, and it looked like if you sat on it, it would fall through. Now, I haven't even gotten inside the church yet. When I open the door, I'm staring at not a greeter stand, I'm staring at 3 wheelchairs. I actually had to turn and look a different direction to see the greeter stand, which was farther inside the foyer. And there was a person there that kind of looked at me and went, I said, good morning. Oh, good morning. Good morning. Yeah. You must be Pastor Keele. Yeah, I am. Oh, we've been expecting you. So as I talked with them that afternoon, they're like, we can't understand why people don't want to come here. We're friendly people. We're nice people. I said, you are, but let me take you on a walk outside. Everything about your church says your church is dead before you ever get inside of it. Time in erodes awareness of. We begin to get blind to those things that we just, well, yeah, we're used to it. And yes, someday we'll get around to taking those bushes out of the planter. But what it says to me is, as a newcomer, that place is dead. I mean, look, even all their trees are dead. All their bushes are dead. Their bench is going to fall through. Their doors are peeling and stained. And when you open it, you're looking at wheelchairs. Even people inside this place can barely get around. And I said, the subconscious things that you're actually having people look at before they ever meet you to see how friendly you are telling them a story that you have died, or you're barely hanging on by your last breath. And so as a result, they're going, well, why should I go there? I said, it doesn't take long, just get some Roundup or some other weed killer and hit those weeds in the cracks in your pavement out there. Get those off of there. Take the bushes out. Put silk trees in there if you don't want anything else, something that looks like you're alive. We changed the doors on the front, had glass doors. We moved the wheelchairs off and put them in their own little closet thing that were accessible quickly for those people that came in. But we moved the greeter stand as soon as you open the door, and we taught them a lot of things. We did a total remodel on the church. We gutted their bathrooms and started over. They were in horrible shape. And that little church has actually done some growing. I was back down there, and they had added another 25, 30 people coming per Sabbath. So, as you look at those kind of things, you've got to see that time in erodes awareness of. The same thing happens with kids. When you don't ever talk about kids, when you don't think about kids, when you don't prioritize kids, you don't become really aware. You erode the awareness of, and then suddenly the kids aren't there, and you're going, oh, wait, where did they go? Why aren't they here anymore? And so when we go back to that pie, everyone rises when we focus on young people. It doesn't diminish the pie. As I said, when we started with that small pie, the one there in the middle, and we gave more responsibility to young people, what we found was it didn't diminish the pie. It actually increased the size of the pie. They brought in more, and everyone rose. And so we've got to look at how we prioritize. So here's some areas. How do you prioritize young people and families everywhere? Well, you can do that in the worship service. You can have them actually on the platform. When I first got to GCA, no kids ever got on the platform. The whole perspective was, you sit there and you watch us. And when you're old enough, maybe you can do this. Well, my friends, when we wait till they're old enough to do this, they're not here anymore, because they're not going to wait around. Interesting thing. I met a guy at one of our churches down in the southern region a few years back. He was 35. He was a comptroller for a company controlling almost 14 million in assets. And yet his church would not let him take up the offering because he might steal. When we look at young people that way, and the guy was in his 30s. When we look at young people that way, we say, though you might make a difference in the world, you can't make a difference in the church. So we let them begin to teach them how to do worship. When you go to the GCA church, even now, before the worship service, we're walking through the service and we're saying, when you get to this, make sure you have them stand, make sure you have them sit, or whatever, to help develop them to say, this is how we do this, okay? We walk them through that. And then afterwards, if something goes wrong, we debrief that with them. How could you do that better next time? What would you do differently? Recognizing that failure is not fatal. It doesn't determine who they are. But church programs, different things that they can do, discipleship. How do we prioritize them in church finances? How do we prioritize them in outreach and in church leadership? The idea is that we're not saying you do this to the exclusion of everybody else, but you say, where is it we can have the youth involved in this? And that's a better question. Not, okay, I guess we better throw something at the kids. But if we're going to develop this new program, how can we develop it so that youth can be involved? On GCA Church, we have 8 high school kids sitting on the church board. There's kids sitting on every board and committee. People said to me, well, Pastor Don, but we have delicate issues to deal with at the board. And I said, if you can't deal with those in a God-honoring way in the face of teenagers, then you're doing your board wrong. We had, at the last church I was out at, Metaglade, we had 4 kids on the board there. And we had a situation where our church treasurer suddenly decided that he wanted to divorce his wife and live with another lady, but he still wanted to be church treasurer. Do you see a problem there? So we talk about church discipline. Well, the senior pastor came to me and he said, how are we going to deal with this with the kids? We can't have them on the board. I said, no, they need to be on the board because this guy is the parent of their friends. And they're seeing what's happening to that family, and they're watching, and they're watching that whole family self-destruct, and they're watching to see what the church is going to do about it. And if you cut them out of this conversation, you cut them out of a great learning experience. And so I began looking at that, and they said, well, he said, well, then you've got to deal with it. I said, okay, fine. Well, I was friends with the treasurer. I said, let me take you out to breakfast. So I took him out to breakfast and I said, listen, you need to stop and think about what you're doing and think about doing the right thing by your family, by the church, everything else. And he said, but I love this lady. Maybe you do. He says, I don't respect my wife. I don't love her anymore. I don't think I ever have. And the stuff they all give you. Okay, fine. Then if you're going to make that kind of choice, then there's another choice you got to make, and that is in responsibility to the church, in response to the church. I think that you need to have at least enough integrity to say, if I'm choosing to go opposite of God's will, then I'm also choosing to step down from my role. You can't have it both ways. So I said, I'm going to pray with you, and I'm going to pray for you all this week. And next Monday, I'd like to meet with you again for breakfast, and I'd like you to give me your decision. And if you choose to stay with this other lady, I'd like you to also hand me a letter saying that you're stepping down and that you'd like your name removed from the books. You need to do at least one right thing here if you can't do the other. I'm praying you go back with your wife and you'll ditch this lady. Well, we came back together next week, and he said, I just love her so much, I can't live without her. And so here's your letter. Well, I went to board the next night, and I told him, I said, I've talked with him twice now. I took him to breakfast. We had this conversation. This is what I told him. This is the choice he makes. And here's his letter saying he'd step down and he'd also give up his church membership. And so with that, we didn't have to have a messy battle. And the kids looked at that and they went, well, he's making a bad choice. At least the church stood for something. So if you can't do church board in such a way that honors God, you're doing it wrong. If you can't do it in front of kids, you're probably, you shouldn't be doing it. So as we look at this whole thing, church leadership and everything else, we look at those different areas of the church. We've got to ask the question as we plan, how can we include young people in this ministry? How can we include young people here? How can we include young people there? And when we begin to do that, we've come to the point of prioritizing young people and families everywhere. Okay, we're going to pause for some questions or thoughts.
Basically, what I'm hearing, good morning, guys, by the way, is that
Good morning.
We've been, because these principles are the same principles of church growth, we've just been cutting out the most, I guess, the highest commodity, the biggest force within the church.
Yep.
We've been cutting them out. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Unfortunately, that's been our culture for a while. Some of the things, Don, that I'd like to throw out there is it can get scary when you give the reins over and you see kids trying to, or the young people trying to bring in their ideas. And I say it because I experienced that in the past. I don't as much anymore, but I saw the same with me. Those are scared of just letting go, because what if, and I think it's a lack of understanding true mentorship on behalf of the adult generation that sometimes is difficult. They find difficulty in including and giving over the keys, so to speak, giving not just, like you said, cheap labor, but letting the kids carry a significant load. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
I think part of the fear comes from they're going to do it wrong, because we always have that thing: if you're going to do something right, you'll make sure it's done right, do it yourself. But they're going to do it wrong, which means if you look at it, we haven't trained them well. I'm not saying hand over the reins without training. I'm not saying do it just haphazardly. What I'm saying is, if you walk alongside them and you begin to explain it to them, and you involve them in wrestling with those issues the church is facing, you'll find that the kids, if they're going to stay there and wrestle with those issues, they're not going to be running from the church. They may come up with different solutions than what we have, and many times they can be better solutions because they're more apropos to the times. But go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just can't help but see a parallel of what I experienced unknowingly. We were planting a church in Puerto Rico, an English church on the east side of Puerto Rico. I think it was the first or the second one in Puerto Rico, English-speaking church. And I was the youngest one there. I was 16. I didn't want to know anything about doing anything in church. I mean, I was more after the girls than anything at that age. And they put me as the adult Sabbath school teacher. Lord have mercy.
Wow.
And it was crazy. You had 15 adults there, at least 15, 16, and I was their Sabbath school teacher. Lord, and there were days where Sabbath where I was irresponsible. I wasn't going to bother with it. But then I realized when I didn't bring it on, so to speak, and read through the lesson, it was unacceptable. It was, and that was a turning point for me. They were crazy at what they were doing, but God knew what he was doing, I guess, as well. And that made a difference for me. That was it was eye-opening at that age. Just shy of 16, I remember.
Look at you now.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, that's good, Richard. Thank you for sharing that. And it's great to have that personal experience to lean on and understand. From what I hear you saying there, Don, and from personal experience, these kids who you include in church board and all, it's good to have them there, but they need a little more. They do need that personal coaching from a pastor, and they also need a pastor or a person on that board who can run interference for them, to pull them into the conversation and not just have them there just observing. And I've had to, in the past, when I pull young people on the board, I've had to have pre-meetings with them. To kind of let them know what to expect and what's going on and why we do this and that. And that made them feel a lot more comfortable. And also made them, give them enough ammunition to understand where we're trying to go, so they could make points and all. And so just to sum up what I'm saying, as pastors grab hold of this idea in church boards, there's still going to be the need for personal mentoring and coaching on the side, and then advocacy during the meeting to make sure that those young people's voices are being heard and respected.
No, I think that's exactly right. Matter of fact, I did a pre-sheet with them to say, and they get the agenda, but I would send out a sheet saying, now these are the issues that we're going to be dealing with. Here's the different sides that people will be taking. You can look at this. And then those that wanted to come to a pre-meeting, oftentimes they were at rec just before board, so they didn't want to come. If they wanted to, I was there available. Otherwise, I'd send it out a couple days ahead of time, and they could come by anytime and just talk through the issues with me if they didn't feel like they understood. And then we would oftentimes, if the board got a little bit heated or something, we would stay afterwards. Greg Hudson and I would stay afterwards and talk with them about what had happened and how to process that. So they didn't leave discouraged and feeling like, oh, this is the end of the world, and, you know. But what we found was after a period of 8 to 10 months of having young people on the board, we had to do less and less of that because they caught on, they figured out how it worked, and the other people became more comfortable with having them there, so they didn't talk down to them. They began to include them in that. And matter of fact, there were even times when they would stop and say, well, you know, we've heard from all the adults here. What do you guys think? And that began a process of that intergenerational stuff that happened. And the young people began to realize, wow, we are being prioritized. We had kids on every board and committee of the church. Now, I don't know if they still do because I haven't been there on any of the committees lately, but I know that they're still including young people quite heavily. The idea, though, as we're looking at this whole thing is, no matter what you do, you can include young people in it. Now, a few years back, we began brainstorming I want to put this, see if I can get it to 100+ ways to include students. I just put it in the chat for you. And this is just a brainstorm. There's some ideas that you can use, places that you can say, well, you could include students here, 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 and here. But those are some ideas that help you prioritize young people and families. Some of them are token because there are some kids that don't want to be heavily leaned on yet. They want to be a closet wall, not a load-bearing wall. And that's okay as long as they're still in the house. But we've got to begin moving them to places where they're more and more load-bearing. And as we did that, we found those kids rising to the occasion. And when they went to college, many of them were leaders. As a matter of fact, at one point in time, I went up when Brennan Kirstein was still at the university, and I said, how many students do you employ in the chaplain's office? He said, oh, we employ 191. I said, I want to just know how many of those are GCA grads. He says, I have no clue. I said, well, could you check on that? He said, sure. So he put somebody in his chaplain's office checking on it. He called me back a week later and he said, we have of those 191, 101 are GCA grads. That says something about being intentional. You don't just have 101 from one school and 90 from everywhere else, unless somebody's being intentional about things. And we even sent a spiritual resume on to school with them. We write the chaplains of every one of our universities saying, these kids are coming to your university. Here's what they've been trained in. Here's what they've had experience in. And we tracked them as they went through academy. Every Sabbath or every Monday after the weekend, every person that participated was charted. We kept them in a database. And when they graduated from their senior year, we had their complete history of involvement and training that we could actually send. And so Brennan would say, you know, we don't know who we're going to get. We need somebody to do this or this. And he said, we'd be talking about who can we get? And I'd reach in the drawer and pull out that list. And suddenly I said, well, oh, it says here, so-and-so's done that. And he said, somebody around the table will go, well, I know them, I'll call them. And that's how they kept onboarding GCA grads, because we were being intentional. If the church is intentional, you don't lose a piece of the pie, you gain more pie. But we got to give them a bigger slice of it, and then the pie gets bigger. So that's my particular perspective. Any other comments before we move on to the next core commitment, the last one?
Don, a question here.
Yeah.
For a time, I served as youth pastor at one of the largest churches in Northeastern Conference, the Ephesus Church in Harlem. And our struggle was how to incorporate. We had a fully functioning youth church. That youth church is probably the oldest youth church in North America. It's probably about 60 years old. all, their own officers, own pastor, own sanctuary, etc. And of course, we worship with the adults from time to time. My struggle is when the young people come in on Sabbath, which is the only time they came, apart from AY, was how do you deprogram them from all the hours in the week that they've been in public school and out in the community, and you have only 3 or 4 hours with them on Sabbath? How do you deprogram them to pour into them, to embrace the faith and to want to live the faith and want to be a part of leadership? And, it seems to me that as we wrestle with growing young, that we've got to perhaps give parents a larger share of the burden in helping to bring these young people forward. Because after all, they live with them, they are the greatest influencers. And if the parents can align themselves with church leadership, perhaps we can double or triple or quadruple the impact and the influence that the church can have on the lives of these young people in partnership with the parents.
Boom, mic drop.
Yeah.
They should. That's their God responsibility. Godly responsibility. Well, let me just. I'm sorry, I had to blow up there because that's my pet peeve. That's what it's all about. I mean, if that doesn't happen, we're stonewalled. You can't progress, really.
And that's a very real issue. And again, we've got to help parents understand that all the petty things that they are worried about, you're not wearing a tie today, you're not wearing this, you're not, those are minimal issues compared to the fact that the American culture is sweeping them out the door. So the battle is very real. Here's the other thing that I would say. When I did this, I had a youth church going for a while. And I found that 10 years later, none of the kids that I had involved in ministry, I mean, I had them all the same exact things. None of those kids were in the church. And I happened to attend an alumni association. And when I started asking them which church they went to, which church you go to, well, we don't. I found that none of them. And so I just, being the pastor and the youth pastor, I took over the whole conversation for the room. I said, hey guys, I'm just finding that nobody goes to church. Can you guys help me understand this? And they said, well, yeah, we just never found a church that was half as active or half as fun or half as engaging as what we had when we were here. And so we just stopped going. We're not against the church. We just, so what I found was that my efforts in having them in a youth church totally worked against me. When I began incorporating them in the older church and they began getting in the lives of the real church, they didn't see it as this is for us, we can do what we want. We don't have near as many fights, we don't have to fight the old people, we can just do what we want, which is why people like that, because the old people can do what they want, young people can do what they want, but you take the enthusiasm out of the old church and they begin to die. Likewise, you take any responsibility away for changing the face of the older church, and those kids begin to lose interest. And so part of the issue, I think, lies with the church. Part of the issue lies with the parents. And there's definitely problems on both sides. And obviously, that the parents aren't even reading their Bible most of the time. They're more involved in TV, and they're more involved with sporting events, and they're more involved with their own lives, and some of them trying to, quote, find themselves. And so that makes it all the harder. And especially when you got parents divorcing as kids are in their teenage years, and those kids are trying to figure out who they are apart from mom and dad, and now that dad doesn't know who he is. And so that messes up the whole process there, and they got to go back and figure that out. And so it's very hard for them to figure out life on a day-to-day when mom and dad don't know who they are. And then the church is saying, well, mom and dad, you should take responsibility. And that's why we've got to develop people within the church that can also be mentors for those parents who can't take or won't take responsibility. Again, what I found works best is not trying to lure them to be more spiritual, but to say, if heaven were never promised, what good does the Christian walk do you? What are the pluses? What are the things you can have? even if all you can do is walk with Jesus now and you don't ever see him, you can have the sense of peace and forgiveness. You can have a sense of purpose. You can have, and you begin looking at what you can do, and those things become appealing. And if we present Jesus in a compelling way, many times they'll go, well, that's kind of what I'm looking for. And then their spiritual appetite begins to pick up. And as their spiritual appetite begins to pick up, they begin to feed themselves. And you can actually work with them, even if the parents don't want to. But it is a long haul process. And that's why we've got to be committed as churches to the long haul on this thing. It can't just be a program that we do for a year. Well, that didn't work. Our kids are still leaving. We've got to invest in those kids, those individual lives. Victor, you want to say something I can just tell?
Yeah, Don, you're hitting it right on the head with what you're saying. Those things are very important. Well, I just want to share my experience working in a more of a pseudo-urban, well, it was a seriously urban setting down in South Florida. And we had a lot of high school non-Adventist kids who would come to our programs. But what our programs consist of, we did a lot of just hanging out. We went to the soccer field, we went to the basketball court, we went skating, and we invited everyone, invite your friends, Adventist, non-Adventist, and we just hung out. And I was a cool pastor back then. They didn't have skinny jeans out back then. But just hanging out with them and just getting to know them. And eventually, after building that relationship with them, I was able to go in the direction that you're talking about and begin to ask them questions like, hey, what do you think about God? What do you think about Christianity? And just hearing what they have to say and just winning their confidence. And from there, beginning to give them invitations to know more about God and church, and talking to them about eternal life and what that might look like. The end of the story in one of those ministries is that we ended up baptizing a lot of these high school students whose parents didn't come to church, wasn't interested in church, but they were asking the question, where are my kids going on Wednesday evenings, on Saturdays, and on Sundays? And they wanted to know. And so they started coming to kind of, spy on their kids. And in a number of cases, we ended up baptizing the parents as well. And so the gist of the whole conversation is everything that we're talking about here, but just hanging out with kids and building relationships. That made the biggest difference in my ministry when I was a cool youth pastor.
Back in the day. Oh man.
Back in the day. And it still worked in my years as a church pastor, just spending some time with the kids, just talking with them, saying, what's on your mind? What do you hate? What do you like about church? What do you don't like about church? And some of those kids are still in church today. And
then being that advocate for them.
There you go.
What we did was I built teams of parents, and I hooked them up with kids. So if they didn't have, if that kid's parents weren't there, another parent could step in. So I actually had parents and teams that worked together in teams to do the Sabbath school programs. And I put them on a 4-week rotation. So there was 2 adults, 2 teens working together, and it could be their own kid or somebody else's kid. Usually it was somebody else's kid, so that we got some intergenerational stuff happening, and we got, some cross stuff happening. And what they would do is they had to work together as a team to put that Sabbath school on. And I said, you've only got it once a month, so it needs to be excellent. And what happened was, naturally, organically, as they worked on those Sabbath school programs, they began to build the bonds and the relationships, and kids could ask those questions they wanted to ask. And what it really is, guys, it comes down to relationships are our biggest resource. And when adults take time to have relationships with kids, and that's why we say prioritize young people and families everywhere. When those adults take time to have a relationship with kids, those relationships make the difference.
And Don, I would support that so much because one party cannot nurture a child from birth to, from cradle to the grave, pretty much. And so if the church partners with parents, if the church partners with teachers, even connecting with their bosses, just extending our reach to wherever they are and having multiple layers of support, I think that our work will be infinitely more effective.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, dead on, Neil. And that's what we've got to do is we've got to begin actually helping our people see that we can build teams to rescue kids. And that's that core commitment. When I say prioritize young people, how can we be involved in the lives of young people? How can they be involved in the life of the church? And developing that relationship and giving them a larger piece of the pie, they will then help us extend the entire pie. And that's the critical juncture piece that we have. Okay, Ken, let me go back to sharing this screen and you can take over. Unless there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, I just was thinking of when Robert Falkenberg was elected president of the General Conference. Gordon Beats was pastor at Collegedale, and Gordon was scripting a lot of the messages for Falkenberg, and Gordon came up with that line to give the young adults a piece of the pie. And then the next year, to expand on that, they went ahead. If we gave them a piece of a pie, they would stay for another meal. And so continuing that kind of a legacy that would build upon build, not just one slice, but to build that relationship. And I just want to second what was discussed this morning. Good stuff.
Oh, I need to give you remote control, don't I?
Please.
All right. You should have it now. If you move.
I'm trying to hit that right arrow. Not without the clicker, but on my keyboard. Yep. Hey, good morning, everybody. This is one of my favorite commitments to talk about. Maybe it's second to unlocking keychain leadership, but it's talks about being the best neighbors and what that kind of commitment means. Donnie, can you set me up so I can hit the right arrow key? There we go.
I'll just do it for you. It's not seeming to work for. I've got you where it says waiting for Ken Ryder to control your screen. So can you move it around at all?
No.
Yeah, you're moving it.
Okay.
Go to
Well, I'll try. There we go.
Yep.
What does it mean to be the best neighbor? I like this group, and we're going to hear more about their ministry and in a testimony in a video a little bit later on. But they simply said, our mission is to be a church for the city. And they set up a little tent at a farmer's market or whatever the event was. And that's their title. They're a church for the city. And I'll tell you, people are identifying with that. And they know that this church is involved in the community and taking responsibility for the kind of things. One of the last core commitments we'll talk about, being the best neighbors. The proverbial question comes up, what does your church do well? Or if your church was to vanish overnight, would anybody notice? What would happen if you just closed up the doors? Hey, Donnie, just down the road from me, Shoney's has closed. We didn't see very many people there, but I know that there was a group of people that would go to Shoney's all the time. Now Shoney's is closed. They have a sign up, says something about COVID-19, kissing their grits, and it's boarded up. But I guess people go and eat somewhere else or something happens. I don't know what kind of effect that has. What if our churches were just closed up? What kind of impact would that make? There must be some common postures of churches that neighbor well, that really make a difference in their neighborhood. So the best neighbors ask, who is my neighbor? That answer might kind of seem obvious to many of us, but who is my neighbor? Jesus answered that really well, I think, in Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan. Let me get some verbal responses. Who's the best neighbors of the church? Who are the neighbors of the church in our community? Who would you say that would be?
I think what the next door neighbors, if we're referring to the building itself or where the church is located, the
Good.
ones
Okay.
right next to it, the
Good.
closest
Those
ones.
that live in close proximity to the church. Excellent. Who
Mhm.
else would be neighbors?
Hey, Ken, I had a chance to visit one of our churches in the southern region, Richard, and next to the church is I would call it a witch's coven. Would you consider them the neighbor? I'm telling you, literally, the pastor showed me next door was a place where the witches have their services and they meet every so often. But I suppose by extension, they are neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah. In the big picture, big sense of the word. Yeah. Wow. Now maybe you could take brooms over to them when they could, I don't know. Well, anyway, patient neighbors respect the journey as much as the destination. I love churches that are involved with those in close proximity. Some of our churches don't have immediate neighbors. Even our Calhoun church, at least the city church, is kind of off in its own area. There's other churches kind of around, but it's more of a rural setting. But as I go to church at Calhoun, and if I take the back roads, I go through a housing project. Those ought to be the neighbors of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on their way. And I'll tell you, that group has a special appeal to my heart. I was raised in a housing project. We were raised on food stamps. I loved it on Thursday when the government truck came and we got cheese and sometimes bologna and some other things that might be extra excesses. And those were highlights. And I suspect that there are people that are living just like that in my own backyard and in the neighborhood or environment of my church. And I often think, and turned to my wife the other day, I said, I wonder if we're doing any ministry to these people. You know, there's children there. You know, there's young adults. You know that they have needs. Well, what is my church doing to have a presence and to be the best neighbor to those folks? Here's an 18-year-old, I think, that really describes what being a good neighbor is. We talk about the big social issues. We definitely engage those, but we don't tell people what to think about them. Whoa, that's a little bit of a departure from some of our Adventist training. We don't tell people what to think, and that is what I really love. I've never felt awkward asking one of the leaders, what do you think about this? Because I know they're not going to tell me exactly what to think. Instead, they engage me in conversation. And then through that, we can derive together the ways that we should live out our beliefs. Hey, isn't that a great statement? From a young person that says, you know what, my church being a good neighbor to me doesn't always just tell me what to do and what to think. And to have those conversations opens up some great avenues to be good neighbors to those around us. So it's more about a process than a position that we take. It's more about posture than proclamation. Don't do this because I said so. Why do we do that? And explore those kind of things. Donnie, you've been experienced, a lot of us and others in academy work. Man, sometimes you get so exhausted and so tired, you say, just do it. That's the rule. That's what we live by. We got to do it rather than engaging them in why this is important, why it matters, and how to go about those kind of positions. Courageous neighbors embrace ethnic and socioeconomic diversity. My church today doesn't look like the church I grew up in. You know what? I'm really thankful for that. I grew up in a white church. In the city in Washington State where I went, there was a black church. I don't remember there being a Hispanic church, but I know that there is today. But we really had separation. I love blended ethnic and socioeconomic diversity. When I went to pastor the Napa church, Victor, my first Sabbath, they told me there are 17 millionaires who are members of this church in the early 80s. I said, my goodness, 17 millionaires. And as I looked around, I thought, well, maybe I'll be able to spot them. I couldn't pick out a single millionaire that was in that church. They looked all the same. Some of them had been farmers, and some of them had had property and that they had sold to developers in the area, but they continued to live the same kind of life that they had. They didn't use their money to flaunt their positions or their economic advantage over other people. And I said, man, what a great place. It was a wonderful church to pastor. But neighbors embrace ethnic and socioeconomic diversity. Racial recognition is not the goal. The goal is what?
Gospel.
The gospel is to love the people in your neighborhood, those at work, those that are at the gym. Again, Luke 10, who's my neighbor? Oh, the one in the ditch. Okay, the marginalized, the disadvantaged, the poor, the widow, the discouraged. A life change comes when your table has people who are different from you. Reconciliation is part of the gospel. And good neighbors help reconcile people to one another.
Ken, I've got a question. Several of my churches have been going through transitions where the other people have been moving into the neighborhood, and the churches, most of those churches have been Caucasian churches. And some are open to the diversity and some are not. Have you found a good way to challenge our people not to leave? This issue of white flight is a current and present reality, even in our conference. Have you discovered a way to challenge our people in that direction? Hey, don't leave when people come. I mean, the gospel is for people. How do we, is there a way that you've discovered?
Well, it's been a while since I've been in a local church, and so I don't want to presume to have all the answers, but I know that a proclamation and a celebration of the life of Jesus, how he treated people, and his inclusionary lifestyle practices helps to bring people in, and you just continue to lift that up, has been my experience. We experienced that somewhat in a collegiate setting, as even at Southern, as the school body became much more diverse. When I first became chaplain of there, if you were a Black student, you went to Oakwood. Okay, well, we began to share programs and diversity programs and go take groups to each other's campuses and share and worship and share. And we began to break down some of those walls and barriers. So, Neil, I'm sure you found you can't beat people up with it and you can't force them into that, but you begin to chip away at the edges little by little and proclaim the gospel, that the gospel is inclusive, it's not exclusive, and to do those kind of programs. Any of the others like to contribute to this experiences that you've had?
Yeah, I would say from my experience, and GCA has become very diverse now. I think a lot of it rises and falls on the leadership. When as a pastor, people follow my lead. And as each person came, we tried to have them over to our house, or at least we did a fellowship dinner every month, and to invite those people to be at the fellowship dinner, and my wife and I would make sure that we sat with the new people each time, regardless of whatever race they were, to get to know them, to show people, look, we're inviting people to this family, but we've got to include them as they come. And that means being physically present with them. It means actually taking time to get to know them. And when people saw me doing that, then other people started doing that as well. And so I think we have to encourage our pastors to do the hard thing sometimes, because I know that there are some white pastors that will just kind of oh, we have a Black family, good, nice to have you, and they won't say anything. Likewise, I've seen Black pastors who get a white family to come in, and they will go with their, they stay kind of racially divided. And if you want to have a diverse church, the leadership from the elders, the deacons, the pastor, all have got to have the mindset that we're going to be ministering to all of these. And diversity is what we're about. But we didn't elevate the differences. Instead, we elevated Jesus and showed how the differences meshed. And I think that everybody began to accept that. I wouldn't say that I'm the poster child for doing it right, because I don't do everything right. Yeah, Victor has to say something about that now. Look, you see him unmute when I said that. Bam, he's on that one.
Yeah, no, Don, I think you're hitting it right on the head, because really the big thing about white flight and trying to exclude other people is really based on the whole idea of fear and unknown. You don't know them. You may have some stereotypical thoughts about them. And I think what pastors couldn't do is they can be instrumental and maybe in like what you were saying, Don, I just add something that you probably already had in your mind, but didn't voice, is that trying to build relationships between your key players in the church and those new faces that are showing up. If the leadership team is predominantly Caucasian, inviting someone of color, or if they're Indian or Hispanic, have a potluck and make sure that those people are there so that folk can get acquainted with them and see that they don't bite, that they breathe air, they put one pant leg on at a time, that they're normal people, and just be instrumental in exposure and building relationships. Let them get to know each other, because that's really the big thing. That people tend to operate out of the unknown and fear, and so they said, we got to get out of here. I had that happen down at Miami Temple. Was a large church down in South Florida, 1,300 members back then, and you had a number of Caucasians that were leaving because the church was transitioning to more Hispanic and Islander Black. And but there were some people who resolved to stay. And one of the key things that kept them there was the fact that they were willing to meet and learn and discover who people were. And once they built those relationships with other people and saw that they're people just like them with the same spiritual needs and all, they said, this is my church and I'm going to stay here and I'm going to add to the flavor of the church.
I would encourage leadership as well as a potential is to involve different ethnic families and in leadership in positions up front. Who are we seeing up front as they're leading and developing worship? Who's helping to greet at the door as they come in? Is it just the standard white Caucasian people that you see? How are we involving them and bridging some of these gaps that can happen so that people become more familiar and that the gospel encompasses all of our diversity? Good. Reconciliation is part of the gospel. I heard a story of an Adventist pastor telling him he went into a small community church that was located right in the smack dab of a congested neighborhood. And the neighborhood had grown up around this church. And on Sabbath morning, parking could sometimes become a problem because people were parking along the street, taking up any parking spaces. If people came to visit the neighbors that surrounded the church, there was sometimes complications, kind of created a little bit of tension. The pastor came into a new pastorate, and it wasn't long before he discovered that the neighborhood was a little bit hostile to the church being in their community because of the space, especially parking on Sabbath. So the pastor said, well, I'm just going to bravely attempt to go door to door to these homes around our church, introduce myself as the new pastor, tell them that we will be mindful on Sabbath morning, but to let them know that it's just for those couple hours on Saturday. We'll probably be taking up the spaces, and we don't want to cause any problem. And he went from door to door, found some hostility, but found that most of the people in that community surrounding the church were fairly warm and appreciated that somebody from the church had come and said something. He came upon one house and was invited inside to an elderly couple. This couple said, well, they knew it was kind of a problem, but they didn't go out much in the morning. And so they had kind of accepted it, but they'd heard some of their neighbors complaining, and they weren't church people. Matter of fact, they didn't go to church at all and had never had a pastor visit their home. So they were very appreciative. And the pastor invited them to church, of course, and said, anything I can ever do, I'm here. He said, you just call on us. Well, the pastor forgot about that visit as he made others. And I think it was a time period of about 6 to 8 months had gone by, when one Saturday morning, the pastor was greeting in the lobby, and the elderly man from that home that he had come and visited came through the door, shook the pastor's hand, and the pastor said, well, welcome. I'm glad to see you. Did your wife come with you? And this man hung his head and said, Pastor, my wife died this week. And the pastor said, well, I am so sorry. And the man said, I'm here today, he says, because we don't have a pastor. We don't have a church. And he said, but I want my wife to be buried. Would you do the service for my wife? You know what? That just stuck in my heart as there was a best neighbor. No affiliation, no tithe or offering, no contribution, not really even hardly a relationship, but in a time of need, this man found that pastor to be a good neighbor. Boy, if more of our churches operated like that in the neighborhood, I think it'd make a profound difference.
Mm-hmm.
All right, come on. We're not moving here.
And Ken, if I could say in the meantime, we're not going to win people with whom we don't have relationships.
Absolutely.
If we're going to win our neighbors, we got to know them. They got to know us, and they've got to feel comfortable coming into our space.
Isn't that so true, Neil? And look at that. For that, at least that pastor, would you say he had a relationship? Well, I don't know, but at least he had an openness, and he had made contact, and he'd left the door open, and this man happened to walk through it. So we don't have to know their whole life story or everything to have that kind of spirit. A good point. Here's a guy that's going to tell us a little bit more about his church and about his experience. I think you'll find this touching testimony.
I grew up in a housing project in East Dallas, a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Was born out of wedlock, parents, teenage mom, dad dropped out of high school and then married my mom later. It's hard watching your parents struggle. You know, it's hard watching a dad that doesn't have a high school diploma have to hustle. There was a church that they would send like a church bus into our neighborhood and come kind of old school style, just come and collect a bunch of us kids, and just showed us a lot of attention. I mean, they weren't intimidated by the reputation of our complex or anything, and they would just send folks in. They would care for us. They walked with me for a decade. They walked with my family. My family was homeless for a bit. They stayed with us. They cared for us. When I got into college and was not a good student, they reminded me that I could do better. They helped get me through seminary and displayed sort of the long-suffering nature of God towards me. Pastoring a congregation and caring for a neighborhood, like really looking at my role in those dual ways of saying, you know, it's not just enough for me to pastor the people within my church, but actually we want to care for the neighborhood in which we're placed. It's not an issue or a cause for me that it's very deeply, that these are family matters. And because of the personalness and the times where I think, man, it'd be easier to just to do something else, or to do something different, or easier to not have to sort of face the passion of leading a church that longs to be both multiracial and multi-class, or multi-ethnic, and embody a diversity of economic backgrounds. That when I think, I'd rather just maybe turn the diversity quotient down a bit, that I have to think about, well, if I did that, then I wouldn't have been reached. So, as a son of St. Francis Square Apartments on Toledo Road in East Dallas, I'm ever and always looking for that place, and for those kids that were like me, those families that were like mine. And so to turn my back on that is to turn my back on folks that I grew up with. So I can't do that.
Mm. That's quite a testimony, isn't it? He can't turn his back on the people that he grew up with, the family and the roots from which he came. And for him, that's a church. Man, that just rings true for me too. And I can do more. I really can. I can do more. Hospitality. I think that of all the commitments, this might be the one that could be the least threatening to start with for a congregation. It might be the entry level that we could use. Lonnie, you're going to have to stop that. Yeah. Hospitable neighbors look for ways to neighbor well. What can we do? How can we be creative? And sometimes if you're going to start a growing young emphasis in a congregation, this is the way to do it. How can we be more hospitable? And what are some ways that we could do that? Some of our churches do really well. Some of us could partner better with local charitable organizations. Rather than just thinking we have to do it all on our own. How could we partner? How could we provide this if somebody else is providing something else? But hospitable neighbors, we look for ways. What can our church do? What could we do better?
Again, I'm just thinking, we have a good number of our churches now who are contributing to the neighborhood, to our communities by, distributing food, of course, the food crisis. And one of the burdens I have is how can we go beyond just distributing the food? Not just having people drive up, we put the food in their trunk and we don't even establish a relationship. We don't know their names. They just come, we give them, and nothing else happens. The same thing with VBS. The kids come to VBS for 2 weeks, we do our thing, and then they're gone until next year. How can we be wise, in establishing, relationships and go beyond being just kind to establishing relationships?
Exactly. And otherwise it's just hit and miss ministry. And maybe ministry is not even the best word. It's just hit and miss. It's one-off kind of contact. VBS ought to be maybe a year-long process. Yeah, we have a 2-week kickoff, but what are we doing the rest of the summer? What are we doing? Can we do something weekly? The bus idea is so great, man. If you get an old vehicle and pick up kids and bring them, there are parents that are celebrating an hour off or 2 hours off, a relief from parenting. They're tired or they're looking for something for their children to do. And I know that COVID has affected that, has had an impact, but there are a lot of other things that we can do to help in our area. I think somebody else wanted to jump in and say something there.
I was just still churning on that video. What he said towards the end kind of gave me a little epiphany this morning, and that is, he said when it comes to scaling back or whatever, he said then it's missing people like me, and I can't do that. And just maybe, I don't know, as we place pastors, maybe one of the things we need to do is say, where did you grow up? Because that growing up portion gives people the passion for what they do. You know, I grew up on boarding school campuses, and that's why I kind of gravitated towards boarding school work and pastoring a boarding school church. But this guy, I mean, I wouldn't feel comfortable down in the city because that's not where I was raised. I've gone to the city, I've done a lot of homeless work and that kind of thing. But as far as naturally gravitating to it, that was kind of an epiphany for me. I hadn't thought of it that way before. And so perhaps when we start placing pastors, and maybe you guys already do this, I'm not in your loop, so I don't know. But as we look at that, you know, if we put inner city guys with inner city churches, because they grew up there, it might be more impactful. They might have more ideas. Victor, you're going to say something.
Yeah, you always see me when I unmute. Neil, that's a great question. And as I think about it and reflect upon this video, this thought comes to mind. There's a difference in adopting a community around a church and simply putting on programs. There are churches that do the vacation Bible school, and they'll do dinner with the doctors. They'll do different events that will bring the community in, but they're failing to adopt the community itself to the extent where they view that community as their extended family, their mission field. And so everything that they do is not programmatic, but it's to address issues and build relationships in the community. And I would see a church that operates from that premise, putting on a vacation Bible school because it's what's needed by that community during the summer months. And it's not just a 1 or 2 week program, but it may go for a longer period of time to give those kids something to do, to help those parents out who are working and can't be there to watch those kids. And so it's the mindset of adoption will really inform how we do ministry to the community, which I believe you won't have these broken programs, but everything will flow because you're trying to meet a need while you're trying to build family and relationship. And when you get there, like this man, I mean, he didn't know this guy who lost his wife, but he did just that one act, inform this guy that here's a person in this community that cares. And I can believe I can trust them. Wouldn't it be great if every one of our churches could build that type of relationship through the things they do? So that's something that's very close to my heart as well.
Yeah.
I think I've said enough.
Oh, good thoughts. Thanks for sharing that. I mentioned earlier last week of the group called SALT down in Orlando, Florida. This group of young adults that just said, we're going to act locally. We've been involved and come through churches where we've gone overseas and we've thought globally. We've done mission. We've built churches. We've provided relief. We've done medical clinics, and all good work, all honorable. And he said, but we're here in the city of Orlando, and we're surrounded by a lot of homeless people that are hungry, that need clothing, that need showers, that need haircuts, that need help with job placements. And you know, they just started so small, a group of 6 or 8 young adults, and this thing has just blossomed so incredibly under the power of the Holy Spirit. And they're just acting locally. And I'll tell you, one of my takeaways, again, Victor, along these same lines, was that they don't call the people that they're serving homeless anymore. They're called friends.
Oh.
And they meet their friends in town at different locations, at different venues. Sometimes they see them on the street, but they call them friends. They're not treated as, quote, homeless and categorized as marginalized homeless. They're known as friends. And as I heard them exchange those kind of greetings with one another, you know what? Even after just a couple hours there, I said, you know, these people are my friends too. I don't know them. I don't have relationships, but I was able to call them friend, not see them as, quote, a homeless person. So the ability to think and act both locally and globally helps us become good neighbors. I would love to see some of our academies, and some of them are doing it. Donnie, I know that we've taken groups up from some of our academies into the Appalachian country in Kentucky and done some good work. You know, that's local work. It affects day-to-day living. Man, those kids come back changed. And if not changed, they've been impacted. And if not impacted, they've had an opportunity to see how some people are living without running water, without indoor plumbing, without the necessities and things that we take for granted. And that can happen locally as well as globally.
You know, Ken, I'm just thinking if we were to follow through on your point, what a difference it would make in our churches. We own multiple buildings in inner city areas and around you know, areas that are struggling. And many of these buildings are worth millions of dollars, and they're open for just 3 or 4 hours per Sabbath. Can you imagine if our church perhaps was not run by attorneys, meaning the lawyers tell us, well, you know, if you open up, you got this liability and that liability. If we just had the mind of Christ to, you know, cordon off a section of the building and put some showers in there so that, you know, these friends can go and shower. They can make phone calls. They can get close to where to go on interviews. They can, you know, can you imagine the impact we would have? We would never have a church to go a year or two without one baptism. And that's the thing that grieves my heart when we see so many of our churches year after year, one baptism, 2 baptisms, or 0 baptism. And they receive grants for evangelism, but it's not being used in a wise way to reach people. You know, we're more spending money on programs and presenting to the choir as opposed to reaching to the friends who are beyond our gates.
Well, thanks, Neil. That's good stuff. One more salt illustration. When they got their shower trailer and monies were donated for that shower trailer so that their friends could have a place to get cleaned up, the group leadership said, you know, how are we going to get water? You got to have water for these showers. What are we going to do? How are we going to? We don't have a portable water tank. We'd run out quickly. What are we going to do? You know that the city of Orlando gives them access to city water throughout the city of Orlando, where they take the trailer and they can hook up, and the city of Orlando is covering any of the cost. God has so many ways to provide for us when we step out and act in love and become the best neighbors that we can be. Listen to local and global neighbors, and then listen to your congregation. What are the needs of our congregation? What can we do? Here's a statistic that just shook my world the other day. I was listening to a speech by someone who's involved in foster children and taking foster kids in. Do you know that if one family in every church in the United States of America would just take one family, one kid, there would be no foster child program in the United States of America? We could erase that whole element of foster kids and foster parenting if just one family in every church took one kid. And that's amazing. What are we doing for foster kids, or for that kind of thing? So what is our congregation saying? What can we do? What can we dream about? What are the differences between the pictures of your church and the pictures of your neighborhood? Oh, there's a great question. We're going to spend just a little bit of time with it. Sometimes we don't know the differences, or we really don't know the neighborhoods in which we live. And there's a great resource that's available to us. It's called data.census.gov. Mark that down if you want to, data.census.gov. This government agency gives us a report of the census report about our neighborhoods. Donnie helped us look up here the zip code for 30701. That's Calhoun, Georgia. Let's look at this. Kind of interesting. Just real quick, we'll spend some time to show you what this site can tell us about our neighborhoods. How many people, population in the zip code of 30701? You're muted, Neil. 40,000 people. Okay. Look at what the median age level was. I was surprised at this. What's the median age of the city of the Calhoun, or at least that county, 30701? 36. Man, I thought it would be a little older. That's right in the middle, kind of a young adult range, isn't it? Okay, that should tell us something. Only 8%, 65 to 74, and that's a growing group. I kind of like that group more and more as I get closer, but we're just 8% of the population. Almost 5%, 75 or older. So we're not an older type of community, 30701, where median age is 36. Quite a few high school age kids, almost 20%, 8 to 17 in the school age, okay? Interesting. What are we doing for those things? Look at this, tells us some more census facts. Who's married, who's never married, widowed, divorced, separated, never married. 25% are not married. I wonder what that means. Does that imply a lot of them are living together, or are they just staying single longer? Might be interesting to know. Some college, pretty well educated group in Calhoun. I didn't suspect that either. I thought we'd be pretty much rural type agriculture, more farming type of things, but we got a pretty well educated group here in 30701. All right, where's my next one? Oh, this thing does not like to work. All right, there's our population. It's broken down. How many whites? Oh, Donnie.
I got you.
Sure doesn't like me. Are we primarily a white Caucasian? Well, primarily 29,000 that, but we have some with 2 or more races. 2,000 Black or African American, not very many. We're not real diversified in our 30701 area. Okay, well, there's just a little resource that you can use. Again, this would be a non-threatening way to introduce how to be a best neighbor on an entry level for a church that might be saying, how can we grow young? Hey, let's look at our community. What's the makeup? What's the chemistry? What's our age group? What are the things coming that can help us determine how we might be better neighbors? What are the differences between the pictures of your church and the pictures of your neighborhood? I think I'm about ready to wrap up here. How do your upfront leaders reflect your neighborhood? Okay. What does it look like up front? Do you have diversity in your leaders? So if a visitor comes in, what do they see? Do they see primarily just a one ethnic group that's leading and directing and leading out? Or is there a wide variety? Does your upfront leadership reflect your neighborhood? And that was one thing that we really had fun with in a collegiate setting, because we had such rich ethnic diversity that we would invite them, especially on our Friday evening, which was more of a family type school vespers, to involve our ethnic groups into the programming up front, not only just in music, but we would have prayers in different languages that represented it. And then somebody interpret those prayers, or talk about a custom that was in their country, or something that was important to them when it came time for worship or family worship, and to celebrate those differences. And people, at least at collegiate levels, kids would respond so positively. Oh, I learned something really great. Help me understand something about that. But do our upfront leaders reflect our neighborhood and our church diversity as we worship together? I want to be a better neighbor. If my church disappeared, would people notice? Why would they want my church to return if we did disappear? These are some questions that we ought to ask ourselves, and they're not threatening. They're just questions that we can throw out. What are the top 3 things my church does for my community? What about disasters? I know we're pretty good in disaster relief and coming in, but do we have follow-up? We worked with a group of kids that would go down and provide hurricane and storm relief damage, especially when, it's been about 10, 15 years ago when those seemed like Florida was just getting hit after hit after hit. And when we go into the communities, we took the blue tarps and helped just cover up people's roofs. Kids could get up on ladders and place a tarp over a roof and at least keep it from leaking or keeping from more rain or water to come in. And you know what they called our group? Well, we weren't known as the Seventh-day Adventist Relief Group. We were known as the Blue Tarp People. Oh, you're with the Blue Tarp People? Will you come? Oh, you're with the Blue Tarp People. You're safe to work with. Oh, you're Blue Tarp People? We can trust you to come and put a tarp on our house. We know that you'll take care of us and you won't rip us off. And the Blue Tarp People. And I thought, you know what? That's okay. You know, I'm not known as the Seventh-day Adventist Youth Group, but I'm the Blue Tarp People, and it had a good reputation. What are the things that we're doing for our communities in these type of situations? Be the best neighbors. Let's continue to strive to do that. Any other comments that people would like to add? Because that's about.
Well, I think you missed one question. You jumped over because you hit it twice, but I went back to it because I think it's an important question. With which other agencies does your church collaborate?
Yeah, I looked for that and couldn't find it. Thank you.
You actually hit it twice. I saw it go to the one and flip right across, but I wanted to go back to it. So I thought that was another one.
No, it is very good, and it's wonderful to be known in the city as people that can collaborate with other groups, and we don't have to do it alone or stand alone. And so many times there's other civic organizations that are just looking for help, or they don't have the resources or the manpower to do a specific thing, and the church can come along and say, hey, we can do that. We can do that. We can provide that, or we're already doing that. Let's team together and be effective.
Here in Calhoun, we found that there were different people that were very good at going around the different churches and hitting up each one. I think that's only indicative of Calhoun. I think that's about everywhere. But what we found was the Voluntary Action Center keeps a database. And so we began to collaborate with them, and actually, instead of developing our own community service center, we began to support them financially every month. And then say, as people would call us, we'd say, well, we do our helping through the Voluntary Action Center. You can go there and they'll take care of you. And if they told us, well, I've been there, they won't help me. What that said was, basically, I've abused their system, or I've already gotten everything I can get out of them. And I'm just looking to see how many more people I can hit up. And so by collaborating with them, we actually helped reduce one of the issues in Gordon County, which was people who went around. Now, the Calhoun Church set up their own food bank, but what we advised them to do was to see if they can connect their database with the Voluntary Action Center database, so they could see, you know, and so that's what at least they did initially. I don't know if they're still doing that, but as they began to look back and forth, they began to see how people were abusing the systems that were set up to help people, and trying to take them. And they even found one person that was actually taking the stuff and retailing it themselves. So, you know, it's 100% profit that way. You get it free and go sell it. So that began to cut those kind of things down. But by collaboration, we found that we could get a lot farther, even in this small community, than we could on our own.
And
So
yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, there's another thought
No, go
that with being good neighbors, I think we would get far much more out of our own members. Our members simply come to church and they go home. I mean, to be out there in the community, serving others and connecting with people, there'll be a joy, there'll be an energy in their faith. They'll have Bible studies now, they'll have friends. Most of our members do not have friends, especially non-Adventist friends.
Mm.
And that's killing us when it comes to
Yep.
prepare a list of people you'd like for us to pray for during this evangelistic meetings. They have nobody. So this is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, good point. I got to share just one little more story, and I don't want this to be about me, but 2 years ago, we went on a interdenominational trip to the Holy Land. It was organized by an Adventist leader, but not everybody that participated, of about 40 in that group, were Adventists. And we met an older couple who are strict Catholics, devout Catholic family, Irish Catholic. And his name's Tom and Joni. And we just kind of became instant friends as we traveled on the bus and as we toured on the Holy Land tour. Well, Tom was having a surgery when he got back, and he told me about it a little bit. And he lives down in Tampa, St. Pete area. And I happened to be down in that area, and I knew Tom was having surgery. So I found out the hospital he was in and went in and visited him in the hospital. Man, I'll tell you, you'd have thought I was his favorite physician. He talked about that. He called me, he thanked me, he sent me a note. His wife just put, oh, you came and visited Tom. And we've just maintained a relationship the last couple of years. Tom calls us, he wishes us happy Thanksgiving, happy Christmas. He sends us cards. And he says to me, he says, we didn't know much about them Adventist people. He said, but them Adventist people, he says, they're some of the best people in the world. He says, I can't believe how good they are. He says, we've been missing out our whole lives. He says, now we're still Catholic. He says, but because of them Adventists, he said, we're going to church now every Sunday, much more than we ever used to. He says, all because of them Adventists. And he called me last month and he said, man, I'm having some stomach issues. He says, my doctor isn't helping me much. He says, I know that there's an Adventist hospital somewhere. He says, can you help put me in touch with that? And I made a couple calls. My college roommate is a CEO of the Adventist hospital down in the St. Pete area. And I called him that same day. He called back, got Tom hooked up with an Adventist physician. The Adventist physician said, just come right in right now. And Tom called me the next day and he said, you're not going to believe this. He says, I just met the best physician I've ever had. He listened to me. He took care. He says, who's training you Adventist people? He said, it's incredible. And I said, well, Tom, you're going to be a good Adventist here one of these days pretty soon. And he just laughs and laughs. You know, building those relationships, Neil, like you said, and Victor, making sure that we carry on that. Because if Tom never becomes an Adventist, I'm okay, because I believe he'll be in the kingdom because he loves the Lord and we love Tom. So let's encourage our churches to be not just good neighbors, but to be the best neighbors. Donnie?
So we have come to the end of the core commitments, obviously not the end of the journey, but just in review, first 3 core commitments: unlock keychain leadership, empathize with today's young people, take Jesus' message seriously, fuel a warm community, prioritize young people and young families everywhere, be the best neighbors. And again, there's that wheel that we looked at. Let me see if I can go back and actually find that wheel. I gotta take Ken off my remote control here now. Every time he moves his mouse, it moves mine. But we go back and whoops. We look at this wheel again. Keychain, unlock keychain leadership, empathy, empathize with them, take Jesus' message seriously, develop warm relationships. And as we said, you can be the best neighbors in all of that stuff and still get over here and jump off, because if you don't prioritize, it doesn't complete the cycle. And this is the one where people began to say, yeah, but if we do that, we're going to lose this. Yeah, but if we do that, the kids can mess things up. Yeah, but. And so as we look at this whole thing, we've got to come down to realizing we need to complete the circle, not once, not twice, but it needs to be a perpetual circle, because as we perpetually make that circle, we pull in new people. And as the older ones begin to die off, the church continues to roll. And that's been God's design ever since. That's why he had 12 that he sent out. And the only reason we're here today is because of those 12. Had they not done their mission, we would have no idea. We wouldn't have had the scriptures. We wouldn't have had any of the church stuff that we have today, because those 12 were faithful to their mission and their calling. We're here today. So what we need to look at is next time on Wednesday the 16th, church applications. How can we build this out as a conference for you guys? How do we develop key leaders? And that's a question you need to ask each church. Who are going to be your key leaders for your church to grow young? What's our next steps? What do we want to do with that? So that we can continue this whole growing young Adventist journey in our conference. So thoughts, comments, questions. Again, we don't want to keep it any longer than we need to, but just as we come down to the end of this thing, what are your thoughts? Let's put it this way. Let's go back through like we did last time. What are your takeaways from today? So let's just go through each one. We'll start with Richard because we haven't been able to see him the whole time.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you were paying attention.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I've been on all the way.
I've been getting your messages in the chat.
Now, my takeaway from today, it reminds me that we have to be an all-inclusive church. It's not, if we're going to grow young, if we're going to grow, period, I'll put it that way. I know the emphasis is on growing young, but if you're not growing young, you're not growing, period, because it's the principle of all-inclusiveness and being able to, being willing, we'll put it that way, to include young people, not just have them sit, but include them and give them, like you said, not the little jobs that are not important, but ones that carry weight, ones that help them develop. I think it develops that responsibility in them, like it did me. I remember, were it not for that experience, I don't know where I would be. I don't think I would be here, because there's a reality. It hit me that this is something big, something that they counted on, something that was important. So I needed to do my best at being real neighbors, the best neighbors. I like that thought. One we pressed quite a bit on in our ministry in churches was that I would always say a tract doesn't win people. A tract. Oh no, we got to hand out. Tracts don't win people to Jesus. People do. And it's that the importance of being there. What resonated most with me was that being willing, put it this way, influencing our churches to be willing to risk putting things in the youth's hand and mentoring them through it, whatever that brings. That's the most I got today. That's what I'm gonna again work on emphasizing that within our region as well. It's interesting. Our region is one of the few. I'm noticing that there are not too many young people, but that's not going to stop us from growing young. To the contrary, it's a challenge to be able to make it and change it. So that's where I'm at. Appreciate it.
Very good. Miguel.
I'm amazed that, for example, the U.S. government hire 18 years old people and train them and then put it in the Army or in the Navy or in the Air Force and give them millions of dollars airplane with bombs and a power of destruction, and the US government trusts them and empowered them, and we cannot do the same.
Come on now, preach it, preacher.
So we do not trust. The US government do not hire old people to fly those planes. They hire young people. And I'm just talking about planes, but there is tanks, there is missiles, there is submarines. And when you look, it's 18, 19, 20 years people there. But we cannot trust them. And that's what amazed me. And when we start sharing the pie, we don't want to share it. And the same happens in our level too. If we share the pie and put more pastor on the field, the pie is going to be bigger because the pastor is going to bring more people. But we are no. When we're talking about bringing more pastor to the field, then we start talking about the budget, and the pie is limited, and is the same. So we need to change our minds, and that's what I take from this conversation today. And we need to open our minds to more objective planning, and be intentional. That's it.
Thank you. Neil.
Please, someone now take out the offering plate, and if not, just use it via Go. Powerful stuff, Miguelito. Good thought, man. I'm with you.
My takeaway is what Miguel said. well, you know, I think that it's coming to me that this is a matter of life and death for our church. We don't have a choice. I've got family in Great Britain, and those great, magnificent churches are empty. They didn't learn how to grow young. And the churches now are museums and being converted to dance halls, etc. So it's a matter of life and death. And if our churches grow young, it means that our pastors will grow young, our members will grow young, our communities will grow young, you know, because it's like a ripple effect, it spreads. And I like the idea that, you know, that was shared about being good neighbors. We don't have a choice but to be good neighbors. You know, driving in, you know, and having a good time in our clothes, you know, we like the lodge, you know, someone says, or like the Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Hall, where, you know, you can hardly see a window. Nobody sees what's going on inside. Many of our churches, they're like that. We've got to open up our churches so people can claim those churches. Yes, that's my church. That's the church in Stone Mountain. It's my church too. They may belong somewhere else, but there's an affinity for the church because we are real people. We are meeting real needs, and we're helping them with their children when they have marital problems. We're helping them with that. When they have medical problems, we're helping them with that. We are the church. We are the one-stop church. And if our church will grow young, our members grow young, our community grow young, our conference will also grow young. You know, and we wouldn't have conferences with bloated memberships with just half of the people showing up. So I'm looking forward to the application piece because I see how it will impact our church profile. When we go to do the church profile, we're asking pointed questions. What are the 4 ways you're serving your community? You know, and if they can't tell us, we're going to push them on that. And we're going to insist that the pastor who comes to that church will have a mind to also help the church to grow young and to serve the community in these specific ways and expand it. So I'm excited about what's going to happen next week when we meet.
Let me add to that, right on the piggyback on what you're saying. I think that when we look at those churches close to universities, as we look at placing pastors there, that needs to be part of that whole thing, because you can really grow young with those university students.
Oh, yes.
And they're out there. I'm finding them all over the place that want to be involved. So, okay, we waited best till last. Victor, give us your wisdom, brother.
Yeah, I think everyone has hit it right on the head. I thought about Miguel's comments, and I thought to myself, let's go ahead and give each one of our young people access to a bomb that will explode in the lives of folk and change them forever for Jesus Christ. And I like that analogy. Some things that I was processing in my mind as you all were talking was the fact that when you look at every successful society, every culture that maintains its distinctive traits, that only happens because people are passing down a baton to the generations that are coming up. They instill the values in them, but how those values are articulated, they allow that next generation to do that, to keep themselves relevant. And it's kind of funny that the church has failed to pick up that whole notion of passing the baton. And because if you don't pass the baton, if you don't include youth into the life of the church, then the church does not have a future. It doesn't have a future. And so for me, the first time that I heard about this concept, and even in my years of ministry, the youth, the young adults, they're the key. They are the heartbeat of the health of the church. And when you walk into a church where the average age is above 50, 60, you know that's a church that's in trouble. I'm excited about this. I really appreciate you, Don and Ken, for what you're doing to push this. And I'm excited that the team is excited, the ministerial team. And I want to just throw out a challenge to all of us and a commitment that I'd like for us to take up. And that is, from this day forth, let's not allow the ball to drop again in our congregations. Let's be the voice that will echo this need, the urgency of this need, to every pastor, every church board that we do have any interaction with, every body of leaders that we have interaction with. Let's beacon this call for all of us, for everyone to be sensitive to the whole idea of growing young, because that's the success of our church.
Yep.
My name is Victor Maddox, and I approve this message.
4 more years. 4 more years.
Oh man, I think you control the Senate. All right. You know, as I think about the things that you guys have pulled out of this, you know, I go back to Miguel's military example. It's true that they release a lot of millions of dollars worth of stuff into the hands of young people, but they don't do it without training them. They train them well, and they know they can trust them because they've engaged them in the whole process. And if you go on a battleship, there's a whole, you know, thousands of guys on this battleship or aircraft carrier that are young, but you'll also see the elder statesman, the captain. You'll see those people that are still up the chain of command. It's not that we need those people less. We just need them to be there helping direct and helping to say, this is where we got to go. This is what we need to do. And I see us as those elder statesmen, those, you know, those older members that can now say, guys, as we direct the forces, we've got to begin looking at where we need to go. And we need to be calling and training those young people into that mindset and help them not just stay with their own group as they get older, but get them the mindset as they're going now, so they can turn around and go, oh yeah, that worked, let's go back. And you continue the circle.
Yep.
And so I'm excited about the journey. I'm excited about where we can go with this. I don't see it again as another program. I see it as a lifestyle. I see it as something that we need to adopt and be moving into it so that we can actually begin to develop a whole new culture that says, this is what's important to us, and this is what happens, and this is what works. And as we continue to go through these 6 core commitments, we say these are things that we commit to and we continue to do those, and we continue to develop those, I think we'll continue to see movement, and I think you'll begin to see the young adults especially start to return and feel like, wow, we can be part of a load-bearing wall. We can be part of this building. We can be part of this whole thing, because nobody stays where they're not wanted or needed. Just think about the last time you went to your spouse's Christmas party. You know, if you're like me, when I go, it's like, okay, can we leave now? So, you know, nobody stays where they're not wanted, or they don't feel like they're wanted or needed. And young people are the same way. Likewise, our older members are that way. They don't want to go where they have no purpose. They don't want to go where they have no place to be, no function to fill, no, you know. And so we've got to develop that whole thing that says, okay, from now on, your function is going to be more important. Your function is going to be mentoring elder, mentoring deacon, mentoring Sabbath school teacher. You've filled the role of Sabbath school teacher for years. Now take what you've learned and let's begin building into somebody else. And as we mentor and as we plan and as we work that through, I think we're going to see great things begin to happen. So,
you know, Donnie, the reality is, to stay with the military illustration, AWOL happens. We won't keep everybody. It's not going to be 100%. It's not going to be perfection, but that isn't our goal. Our goal is to build the body and increase and provide these opportunities for the churches to become warm, safe places for spiritual growth to take place. And I'm excited.
Yep. So as you spend the next few minutes, as we get off this call, and you've got some ideas for any of these areas, those core commitments, start jotting those down for when we spend our time next week. And we'll look at how we do this build out and how it can function to help you do your job in your regions, so that it actually becomes a tool in your hand, not just something you have to push. It actually becomes something that begins to energize and help your ministry move along. So, that's basically what we've got for today. We got the 16th, I believe, at 9. Is that what you guys have got?
Yeah.
That's what I've got. And we'll start working on the build out next Wednesday. So, Neil, would you lead us in a prayer as we close?
Sure thing. Lord, we're so grateful for Don and Ken, and for putting them in the place to be exposed to these eternal principles. We're using different vocabulary to describe them, but Lord, these have been the principles of your kingdom from the beginning.
Wow.
Yep.
And it's breathing life into us so that we can breathe life into the pastors with whom we work and to the congregations that we serve. Lord, we've just taken the first initial steps, and these steps will be small at first, but we are praying that as we climb these small steps, we shall reach the top of the ladder where we see transformed churches, transformed leaders, transformed communities, transformed families, but most of all, transform young people for the kingdom of God. Bless each of us, Lord, and give us a thirst and a hunger for our meeting next week, when the ideas that we've been ruminating on will be placed on the table. And we pray that things significant will happen as a result that will create explosive changes in our conference, in our congregations, and in our own personal lives. Thank you again for the time we spent together, and may these moments not be wasted, but will be put to good use for the upbuilding of your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, guys, thanks so much.
Amen. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Thanks, Donnie. Good stuff.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
have a great day. And Don, you got a few minutes?